Well, thank you, and a very, very good morning to all of you. All of you who are clutching your precious mugs of caffeine as you start your day. And for some of you, I know it's quite early. I think there are some of you in the audience who are starting at 3 a.m. in the morning, so welcome. Hope you're stocked up on that coffee. And a very warm greeting to those who are already comfortably into their day today. Thank you for joining us for this panel on collective action, grassroots movements, and leadership. We're hoping to have a very productive and even provocative conversation on the very critical question of what makes or unmakes collective action efforts to combat corruption. You know, why have so many anti-corruption movements which started off successfully, had so much popular support behind them? Why did so many of them just dissipate? And why did actually so many of them succeed when the odds were so high? What gives? What does successful leadership look like in such contexts? So to delve, unpack, and interrogate these very critical questions, which, you know, especially when we are looking at the world today, are so critical, we have a very power-packed panel, and I will introduce the panelists to you now. As I call out their names, the panelist, whichever one I'm calling out, if you could just wave so that the audience knows who you are. It's always good to put a name to a face. So we have Professor Amira El-Haddad of the German Development Institute, and she works on industrial policy, she works on industrial organization, she works on the political economy of the MENA, the Middle East and North Africa region. Very significantly for our topic today, she has researched the Arab Spring, which has been one of the most consequential popular movements in recent times, whose proponents demanded not just governance reforms, but simply just a better life, a better day-to-day life. We all know the story. Amira's rich research experience in the region informs her work on the differing outcomes of the Arab Spring. And we know that while there was a sort of wide swathe of movements, countries ended up very differently from where they had started. So Amira is going to talk to us about that. Welcome, Amira, to this panel. We have next on Mehnaz Rabbani. Sorry, Mehnaz is the program lead on research, policy, and governance at BRAC. Some of you might have heard of BRAC. BRAC is a globally recognized NGO based in Bangladesh that has been hugely successful in using strategies of community mobilization to achieve health, education, and other social objectives. And Mehnaz has been a part of many such initiatives. She's also currently a key member of BRAC's COVID response team. Good to have you, Mehnaz. We next have Michael Ozoigwe. Michael Ozoigwe is the technical lead accountability workstream at FOSTA, or the Facility for Oil Sector Transparency in Nigeria. The program focuses on improving governance in Nigeria's oil and gas sector by reducing incentives for rent capture. The program has actually been responsible for significant policy innovations to actually improve governance outcomes in a sector in Nigeria that's unfortunately known for all the wrong reasons. And Michael brings with him a very rich and varied experience from the sector. Thank you for joining us, Michael. And we finally have, as the other panelist and somebody who will make the keynote for the roundtable, we have Professor Mushtaq Khan. He is a professor of economics at SOAS. He's also the chief executive director for the SOAS Anti-Corruption Evidence Program, and some of you might already know of his work on governance and anti-corruption. So Mushtaq makes up the fourth panelist. I will shortly invite the participants and the panelists to introduce themselves too, but two quick messages on how the roundtable will run and some housekeeping topics. So how we have designed the roundtable, and we know that we're now living in a virtual world, and that makes it very difficult for us to make it interactive and engaging. So how we've envisaged this is we will have a 15-minute keynote by Mushtaq. Then our panelists will use their experience to react to the keynote address and the ideas that Mushtaq puts forward in his keynote address. So we will have the panelists providing about 5 to 6 minutes of their reaction to Mushtaq's keynote. We will then open this out to the audience for a Q&A, about 15 to 20 minutes. If there are any burning questions, we might even make it 25 minutes if we have the time. We'll wrap up this first session of the Q&A and move to the second session of our roundtable, which is I will be, as chair, I will be using my power as chair to scribble down a few notes based on the reactions that the panelists put forward and ask them a few questions based on their input from the first session. So this will be a sort of interactive round of Q&A between the chair and the panelists, all four of them. And then finally, at the end of this second session, we will throw it open for another round of general audience Q&A. That's how we hope to make it as interactive and make it worth your while for having woken up so early for some of you, certainly. Now for some very quick housekeeping points. As I said, we know it's a virtual world and the transition might be very fiddly. In case you have some tech problems, we have a very helpful volunteer, Michael Cornier, who's already been wonderful in helping us in getting certain things right. You can always type in a chat question if you do have a technical question. He's here to help us with that. In terms of how we are going to ask the questions, we absolutely encourage you to ask any question that you might have. Do type it into the chat box. And what we'd like to do is to pull up the audience member who's asking the question onto the stage. That would be absolutely fantastic if that works for you. However, we know that there might be a few audience members who might not want to come up on stage. In that case, if you could just write next to your question that I'd just rather that my question be read out from the chat box. I don't want to come on stage, and we won't pull you up. If you don't, we will assume that you are happy to be on the stage and with the other panelists. So that's pretty much how it will go. I think these are the housekeeping issues that come to mind. If anything does come about, I will quickly intercede and say a few words again. But for now, I will hand it over to the panelists. Amira, Mehnaz, Michael, Mushtaq will quickly introduce themselves, and then Mushtaq will start his keynote. Amira, on to you. Thank you.
So I'm seconded from Cairo University, from the Faculty of Economics and Political Science, where I am a professor of economics, to the MENA project, or the Stabilization and Development in the Middle East and North Africa, at the German Development Institute in Bonn, Germany. And I'm very happy to be with you today.
Mehnaz?
Hello, I'm Mehnaz. So I work for BRAC, Institute of Governance and Development, which is an institute, or a research institute of BRAC University. So I have the opportunity to work very closely with BRAC and also with the government of Bangladesh, as we work at the interface of research and policy influence. So my role is mainly in managing research, and currently I'm working with the COVID response.
So good morning, everyone. Good morning, Pallavi. Good morning, our lovely audience. Yes, for the past 9 years, I've been working with the organization called FOSTA. That's Facility for Oil Sector Transformation. It's a program of the UK aid. I'm very careful not to say DFID. I'm sure most people know what's going on right now. But prior to that, I also, in my research for my doctorate, I looked at collective action. Particularly in managing natural resources, the very special variant of collective action called multi-stakeholder initiatives. So I've been involved in, I've been looking at the EITI, particularly how it's been implemented in Nigeria. And luckily, and I have the opportunity also in working for FOSTA to be engaging directly with implementation of the EITI in Nigeria. So thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be on board.
Thank you very much, Michael. And now if Mushtaq will, Agatha, if you get Mushtaq on stage, he can introduce himself and take forward the keynote. Thank you, all three of you.
Welcome everyone at this unearthly early hour. I'm going to start off the conversation with our team on the panel, who include many people who are absolutely activists, but also activist researchers. And the question we are asking is the one that Pallavi highlighted earlier. Why does collective action so often fail in achieving these big global challenge issues like anti-corruption, which is at the heart of many of the problems that we face in developing countries in delivering health, education, skills, jobs, power, and so on. And in the SOAS ACE research program, which I head and which some of the panelists are also members of, we ask precisely this question of how to make anti-corruption effective and real, which is actually asking the same question of when does collective action and what kinds of leadership leading that collective action succeed. Now, I want to go back to the historical roots of the economic analysis of collective action. And this comes from, as you know, from Olson's classic work, The Logic of Collective Action, where he set up a very simplistic and almost a very naive, but in a sense useful, economistic way of thinking of collective action in terms of the costs and benefits of the individuals who stand to gain from a collective action progress, which delivers something to them, but they all suffer from the perennial problem of public goods, which is free riding, and all of them want the public good, but they don't want to engage in the collective action, or once it's achieved, they might want to defect from that collective action. And this is exactly the problem with a lot of anti-corruption movements. Olson's answer to this was that actually collective action does happen, but it happens when there are subgroups within the group who, in terms of their own interests and their own preferences, value the collective action more than others. And he calls these subgroups privileged groups. And privileged groups are essentially Olson's way of describing leadership. So the leaders have some particular interest in achieving that collective action. They then mobilize and then they solve the problem of collective action by making sure that everybody benefits enough from the collective action to succeed. Now, that early response then sparked a lot of research, including in game theory, looking at how in repeated games in particular, collective action might emerge through various kinds of incentive structures that within group can emerge in terms of both incentives and punishments to organize that collective action. But the issue that Olson raised about differences in the costs and benefits within individuals also raised later on an acknowledgement of a much more serious problem of distributive conflicts within the group, because different subgroups might not only have different benefits, but might want entirely different outcomes from the collective action. So, for example, if you think of environmental activity, collective action to address climate change, you might have within your group, which is society, some people who are mainly the recipients of the externalities of pollution and the costs of pollution, who want to punish the polluters and tax them to make them stop doing the pollution. But there are other people, and some of them might be very poor people, who have no option but to engage in activities which are polluting. And their position is, if you want us to do this, we also want to stop polluting, but you have to pay us to do something else because we have no capacity of doing anything else. And from the poorest people to some rather large companies might have invested a lot in technologies, and they say, actually, why don't you subsidize us to do something else? Now, from a purely economic perspective, whether you punish people to stop polluting or you reward them to stop polluting, the outcome is the same. You have a lower pollution, you have a better climate outcomes, but the distributive implications are quite different. So this was another huge problem that collective action can break down, because within the group, you might have subgroups which want different outcomes, which achieve the same goal, but in very different ways and with very different costs and benefits. And again, game theory has been very good in giving us a lot of detail about how these conflict games might be resolved or not resolved and what the implications are. However, I want to focus on a slightly different problem at a practical level, which is slightly different from the free riding and the conflict problems which Olson began with and game theory has elaborated. And this is the very real problem that we live in a world of uncertainty. And in a world of uncertainty, actually the costs and benefits facing different groups cannot be predicted with any degree of certainty. Right? So the real problem that faces us in organizing collective action at the ground level, at the grassroots level, is we don't know what are the costs and benefits. So the discussion of who is likely to be free riding to what extent and what are the different subgroups and what are their conflicts is fuzzy, because we don't really know what will happen. And I think a lot of the real world problems of organizing collective action and leadership is really addressing this problem of uncertainty, without which the kind of nice models of game theory and Olson and so on don't really tell us a lot, because those assume that we know the costs and benefits. Now, in the world of uncertainty, there are two kinds of responses you can have, and I want to contrast these two approaches as a way of structuring our discussion. And I call these two approaches, one of them is possibilism, and I'm going to explain what that is, and the other is strategic realism. And these are two different approaches to the problem of uncertainty. And I'm going to argue that actually they're related and we need to use both of them, but an extreme version of either is very misleading and can result in failures. So what is possibilism? Possibilism is an idea that we can trace back to Hirschman in his really classic works, including his classic work called Development Projects Observed. And Hirschman, in a variety of ways, in different things he wrote, argued that it's very difficult to predict in advance the obstacles that different public good projects will have. He was largely thinking of infrastructure projects, but what he is talking about is equally applicable to anti-corruption projects or any public good project. And what he said is that most cost-benefit analyses of these projects or public goods projects were actually not very useful, because very few of them predicted the obstacles that would emerge later on. And had they been able to predict some of the problems that would emerge later on, they wouldn't even have started, because the problems are humongous. And the projects which succeeded did so because there was a lot of experimentation and learning by doing, and the people involved in that found ways of overcoming problems that no one had predicted in advance. In other words, Hirschman celebrated the experimentation and learning aspect of problem solving and was pessimistic about cost-benefit analysis of any type, coming up with reasonable answers to these questions. Now, a lot of the mobilizations that we look at in our work on anti-corruption have leaderships which are exactly motivated by that, right? They identify a big problem, corruption. They know that it needs to be solved. And then they know that there will be lots of problems in solving it, which we can't actually predict. People who we think might support us might turn out later not to. People we thought were really lacking any capacity to do anything might come out on the streets and be very active, and so on. So their position is one of activism, which is why many people find possibilism very attractive. Possibilism actually keeps the future open and says we need to engage with the reality, learn from it, and move on. This is a very attractive position. And in a sense, it motivates a lot of leaderships and collective action around the world, even though they might not trace their ideas back to Hirschman. The disadvantage of this position is that while indeed it is impossible to predict all the costs and benefits of all the individuals in any activity, there are severe constraints which we can look at in terms of evidence, and some constraints are much more difficult to overcome than others. And in a sense, what I'm going to argue is that the task of leadership is to identify the paths of progress which are likely to give us feasible improvements, which will then feed back into and enthuse our grassroots support and all the different people we are mobilizing to keep going. And if you don't have that loop happening between achievement and reinforcement, there is disappointment and demoralization, as we see again and again and again, particularly in mass anti-corruption movements, which have happened all over the world repeatedly. The alternative that I'm setting up to possibilism, therefore, is not determinism. It's not saying that the structural constraints on action are so severe that the status quo is in a sense determined. Because if you take that position, of course, then till you change everything, nothing can change. And I think this is a very old debate of structure and agency, where people often think that anyone who is talking about structure is actually ruling out agency, and therefore is like Dr. Pangloss in Voltaire, always arguing that we are in the best of all possible worlds, because if something else was possible, it would have happened. So if it hasn't happened, it can't happen. That is absolutely not the position to take, because it is not only defeatist, it's also analytically wrong. Change happens in the world and we see it all the time. Actually, what strategic realism is saying is that change can happen, but some constraints are harder than others. And then the challenge of leadership is to identify a path which takes us to an outcome which is imaginable. And it is this imaginable that is based on a lot of analysis of evidence, which tells us that actually you can imagine an improvement given your material realities that achieves a better outcome. Strategic realism is about finding paths to these imagined realities, but imagined in an imaginable way. And I think this is where the discussion becomes really interesting, because I'm going to suggest, and this might be provocative, that there are a number of constraints which we really cannot ignore. And these come from a Marxist-inspired background of the material realities. And the material realities need to be understood. And there are two that I want to quickly outline before we go on to the broader discussion with our panelists. The first material reality that is very hard to change in the short run are the economic resources that are available to deliver the solution that we want, to deliver the outcome that we want. Those economic resources have to be imaginable in your society. Now, I don't just mean that you need to pay for the infrastructure. It's much more than that. It's actually understanding that underpinning a lot of public goods is a lot of interconnections. To give you a quick example, the mobilizations to achieve social democratic politics in developing countries and to end the political corruption of clientelist parties has brought out repeatedly in country after country millions of people on the street. But there is a material reality constraining this outcome. And that is that for a social democratic party to win an election, it must promise to spend what is on the budget in legal ways. And that spending must be beneficial to enough powerful groups in society who say that actually this program is one we want to, even if it is generally beneficial to everybody, it must be in specific beneficial to those people whose support you need, for them to fund your party and for whom it is now worthwhile to come out on the streets and support you during elections. If you don't have such a sufficient budget for that, what will happen is, and what always happens, is clientelist parties who can target off-budget resources to clients makes it more attractive for them to support the party with investments and support, and the clientelist party defeats the Social Democratic Party. Now, of course, if the gap that you need to cover in terms of what resources you need in the budget to support it, a social democratic process, if the gap is 2 to 3 to 5% of GDP, then Hirschman's possibilism kicks in. You can say innovation, adaptation, experimentation, we will somehow do it and we can get there. But if the gap is 20% of GDP, if your per capita income is 2,000 and you're taxing 10% of it, it's very hard to imagine what political mobilization and imagination and experimentation will get you to the kinds of tax revenues that will make a properly social democratic politics possible. That's the kind of example that we work with. The solution has to be imaginable, and then possibilism is possible. The second material reality that I want to outline very quickly are the capabilities in your society, the productive and organizational capabilities. And this is really important and concerns us a lot in SOAS ACE, but also in my own research. It is a big mistake to assume that everybody is capable of behaving in the rule-following ways that an advanced country formal sector requires. What we find again and again in our work in SOAS ACE is that there are two types of rule violations that happen in developing countries, at least. There are some people who are powerful who violate rules because they want to. They could have complied, but they want to break them. Those are the people we think of as corrupt. But actually, we ignore that a vast number of people, 70 to 80% of these societies, are actually incapable of following the rules of the formal economy. And they are in the so-called informal sector. They cannot register, they cannot follow the rules, they cannot pay the taxes, they cannot comply with the building regulations. They are perpetually breaking the rules, but we never put them in the frame, we never think of them when we are designing our anti-corruption policies. The problem is that once you start enforcing the rules on the corrupt, you then inadvertently start hitting a lot of the people who you didn't want to hit, and you begin to lose the support that you had from society. It's that kind of problem of not looking at what is the imaginable outcome that results in the failure of these collective action movements for anti-corruption in, for example, regulatory compliance or in terms of tax collection. So here, a feasible path would be to say, how can we first change the rules so that most people can begin to comply with it in the sector that we are trying to address? And only then can we isolate the people who can comply but are willingly or deliberately not complying. Sounds obvious, but actually this basic calculation is often not done, and these big collective action movements begin without a clear strategy, and then they unwind because actually what they're trying to do is not even imaginable. There's no imaginable outcome that would happen without a lot of pre-planning. Okay, so let me now sum up what this means. So in SOAS, we talk about aligning incentives and interests all the time in the SOAS ACE research program. And what we mean about aligning incentives and interests is precisely this. We are saying the solutions that we come up with, for which we then invite the mobilizations to achieve them, must be such that you can imagine that once they're implemented, they will be supported and followed by the people whom we are trying to help. In other words, the very people in the sector will, in their own self-interest and for their own benefit, support the enforcement of these rules. Strangely, a lot of anti-corruption movements fail that test because it's very hard to imagine how, if you were trying to actually enforce those things, most people would benefit from them, given that actually a very significant part of society in these countries are incapable of following the rules for capability reasons. And other people can't follow the rules because the economics of it doesn't allow for, as I explained with the Social Democratic Party, to deliver public goods in a rule-following way. Well, if you can imagine a solution that satisfies those conditions, and often we say this is only imaginable at a sectoral level, you have a vision, you have a plan that is self-sustaining in the sense that the people who you want to mobilize will support it if it was achieved. This is the component of strategic realism. The strategic realism is saying the outcome must be imaginable in the sense that you can imagine you will get there. However, strategic realism doesn't give you a mechanistic way of getting there. It just says there's an outcome here which looks like it is sustainable given all the evidence we have about capabilities, economics, and organization. How you get there is still a possibilist process. It still requires leadership to say, what are the steps? How do we do the step-by-step learning to get there? Because that path is full of uncertainty. You actually don't know what experimentation and fine-tuning you will need to do to get to that point. So possibilism means that the leadership with an achievable and imaginable goal, which satisfies the conditions of incentive alignment and interests and capabilities, will then have to engage in a lot of innovation and learning to get there. So I'm sure that if Hirschman were alive, he would say that when I talked about possibilism, I meant exactly that. I meant selecting achievable goals and then learning by doing to get there. But because his criticism was against this fascination with cost-benefit analysis in economics, he did not make that very clear. So most of his work was basically rejecting this kind of cost-benefit approach to things and celebrating the the learning, experimentation, trial and error approach, which is absolutely right, but trial and error will not overcome the laws of arithmetic. There is no trial and error by which you can generate another 20% of GDP, or there's no trial and error and experimentation by which you can make, informal sector, small firms with very low productivity somehow becoming compliant with the tax rules and regulatory rules which are appropriate for large companies operating in the global market. So the possibilism is necessary once we identify really feasible targets. So here is where I would like to end. I think that possibilism is important in the sense that we have to have a possibilist radicalism. The possibilist radicalism is about finding new and innovative answers, and this is where leadership and agency come in, finding the path to that process, which might mean forming lots of local coalitions and bargaining and concessions and compromises. But that possibilist radicalism has to be combined with a realist incrementalism. And the realist incrementalism, and this is why I often use the term incrementalism. Incrementalism simply says that we need to continuously remember the material realities of where we are operating. The material realities mean that we cannot suddenly generate tons of new revenue. We cannot suddenly change the capabilities of our society. We can do it gradually, and these things are all endogenous. So in the process of solving the corruption problems and in the process of improving health outcomes and education outcomes, you also improve the capabilities of society and the tax revenues, which allow you to make the next step. That realist incrementalism is where analysis comes in. It's where the kind of SOAS-ACE program of finding sectoral solutions that are imaginable comes in. However, once we have identified, and if you go to our website and you see all the different projects we are doing on health, on power sector, on skills delivery, we have all these nice analyses with a lot of evidence saying this is an imaginable improvement. We then rely on the possibilist radicalism, on the leadership picking this up and saying, okay, how do I construct the coalitions and how do I get there? If you can marry these two things, you have a dynamic leadership strategy which can deliver achievable goals. And I believe that this is precisely the kind of positive feedback that is missing in a lot of real world politics in developing countries, so that you have either a kind of demoralization and depoliticization of a lot of people who have been repeatedly out on the streets fighting things like corruption or in favor of democracy, and which is also an anti-corruption movement. And people are just fed up and tired of that, or they swing to really radical populist strategies where they believe that because these leaders seem to be very tough and they're taking on the whole establishment, they will give us something. And that is also equally dangerous, right? So this twin danger of depoliticization or politicization around these extreme possibilist, strategies of populism are the dangers that we need to avoid. And I think that our approach in SOAS-ACE offers a glimmer of what the alternative might be. And that alternative is what I have called radical incrementalism, which is marrying a kind of strategic realism with possibilism. So there's a lot of words there, but I think what I'm saying is something which is extremely important in the context of confusion that we see in the developing world. And the panelists, who are all in different ways, looking at real world mass mobilizations and in some cases engaging with it, I hope we'll not disagree fundamentally. We'll add different things and add nuance to what I'm saying, and then we can have, but they might even disagree with some of what I'm saying. I think what we have is a potential of a really interesting discussion. So I'll hand over back to Pallavi and we go to our other speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mushtaq. Provocative as you promised us in the beginning, but I think there are some very rich themes there from which our panelists can pick from. So I'm going to invite Amira right now to come on stage. And thank you, Amira. It's your turn. Mushtaq, if you could put your microphone on mute so that there is no feedback here. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so thank you very much, Pallavi, for inviting me. I'm very happy to be with you here today. Thank you, Mushtaq, for a fantastic presentation. I'll try to be as brief as possible, but the story is very complicated, as you all know. So I will just draw the main lines of the story. So today I will be telling a story of one of the largest collective action efforts in history, the story of the Arab Spring, which I will limit to Egypt and Tunisia only for purposes of time. So decades of stability disappeared in the eruption of the Arab Spring in 2010. The Arab Spring was a manifestation of people's rejection of the prevailing social contract. The social contract is a framework for state-society relations where the state could provide any or all of the 3 Ps, provision, protection, and participation, in return for citizens recognizing the state's right to govern. In the following presentation, I will briefly take you through the evolving social contracts since independence for the 2 countries, since the 50s, and what forces caused the social contract prevailing just before the Arab Spring to break down. The populist authoritarian social contract prevailed since independence during the 50s and 60s. It was associated with a state-led development model in which the state produced, managed, and distributed goods, jobs, and services to its people. The masses, which were also at the time the middle classes, in return provided the state with absolute loyalty, paid the taxes, and acquiesced to the lack of political participation. They sort of didn't need to politically participate because the majority of the population were happy with what they were receiving from their governments. With the introduction of market reforms in the 70s, a social group of business people emerged, forming the basis for what I call the unsocial social contract. In this contract, industrial policy was captured to favor the cronies of the regime, excluding all other groups of society. The major instrument of privilege were barriers to entry into markets. So barriers to entry into markets limited competition in the markets where the favored firms were, allowing them to accumulate substantial rents, increase their profits, and so they became a low-risk competitor compared to the unprotected counterparts. So banks in both countries were competing to lend those favored firms. They never exited the market, and new ones never entered. The cronies also had no incentive to innovate because they had secured market shares. And the non-cronies or the non-connected private firms didn't have any incentive to innovate either because they couldn't compete with their competitors with artificially lower costs. This situation resulted in the missing middle phenomenon, where there was a concentration of very old, large firms and very few of them, and many, many small informal firms, limiting growth, job creation, and creating massive inequalities in those societies. I'm going to briefly describe the cronies and the instruments of protectionism in the 2 countries. So the cronies were basically the regime's clientele, owners and managers of those favored businesses. In Egypt, they were politically connected figures that had direct access to policy formation, as ministers, as National Democratic Party members, as committee members such as the Economic Policies Committee, which is a committee that was chaired by Gamal Mubarak, the president's son, Gamal Mubarak's son. This committee guided the liberalization process in Egypt, allowing Gamal Mubarak and his clientele to capture opportunities of this liberalization process. Instruments of privilege were preferential access to subsidies, public procurement, privatization deals, providing exclusive operating and import licenses to distribute international brands. For instance, the transport minister, Mansour, had exclusive import licenses for Chevrolet and Opel. In Egypt, politically connected firms accounted for about 60% of net profits in the country. In Tunisia, the cronies were Ben Ali, the president at the time, businesses and his wife's businesses and their extended family businesses. The instruments of privilege were the numbers of firms allowed on the market. These were restricted in markets where those firms existed. The instruments included legal monopolies that were not exclusive to just natural monopolies or utilities. For instance, the tobacco supply chain was subject to a legal monopoly. Outright closures of businesses that directly compete with the president's businesses, like the Boutbeli School or the McDonald's case, about or more than 50% of the economy was subject to full or partial entry restrictions. The estimated total value of clan confiscated assets amounted to 1/4 of Tunisia's GDP. So what did the cronies give to the state in return, their deliverables? It was basically, as the usual story goes, political support. In Egypt, business people literally bought votes to keep the government in power in the pseudo-democracy. During the 2010 elections, prominent business people such as Ahmed Izz, famous Egyptian tycoon, hired thugs to intimidate ordinary people and stop them voting. He bussed thousands of employees of his steel factory and government employees to go and vote for the regime. In Tunisia, employers of the Employers Association Utica closely supported the regime by issuing a statement in 2010 calling on the president, please stand the elections in 2014. But in the meantime, the disadvantaged social groups were growing. These were public sector employees who used to be the second most privileged group after the cronies. They had enjoyed lifetime job security, social protection, annual public sector wage raises. Tunisian average government salaries were 67% above the national average. And in Egypt, those were twice as those as in the private sector. Further privileged groups within the public sector were, of course, the judiciary, auditors, security forces, and of course, the military. So the market-oriented neoliberal reforms introduced cuts in public sector employment and in the wage bill. The second growing disadvantaged group were informal sector participants who were the least privileged of all employed. The poor cannot afford to be unemployed, so they joined the ranks of the informal economy and low productivity jobs. The relationship between the informal sector and the state is portrayed by Tendler's Devil's Deal, where some generated benefits allow the toleration of informal activities. The benefits of the informal sector is that it creates jobs for the masses that are excluded from the small captured private sector, and so helps stabilize the regime in an implicit deal guaranteed by the inability of informal workers to form unions or associations or to protest their grievances. Non-connected private sector market participants and the unemployed form the third and the fourth growing unprivileged group in society in both countries. The unemployed are the worst off. Middle-class youth who would have gone into government jobs under the old populist social contract do become unemployed. Unable to join the undynamic, scantily job-creating, crony-dominated private sector, the unemployed, together with informal sector participants, were not just excluded from industrial policy, but they were also excluded from institutions such as health, financial services, the judiciary, and social security. So how did this unsocial social contract break apart? With this blatant favoritism and discretion in implementing industrial policy, unemployment, poverty, and inequality have steadily grown. And as legitimacy was eroded, governance of the informal sector was left to the security apparatus. The sector has become increasingly a target for harassment and demands for petty corruption by the authorities. The unsocial social contract failed to deliver, gradually excluding more and more social groups. The marginalized groups realized that the existing social contract is unsocial, that it is just a deal between autocratic governments and their crony businessmen, that they are entirely excluded from shaping any part of this contract. This marginalization created a butterfly effect, steadily building opposition to the unsocial contract. In December 2010, Mohamed Bouazizi, an informal street vendor in Tunisia, set himself on fire after a violent confrontation with a police officer. I get very emotional here. And 2 weeks prior to his death, the masses organized in overwhelming collective action, forming a critical mass, eventually instigating the first flame of the Arab Spring in Tunisia. Egypt followed. Masses of protesters driven by their economic grievances and underlying political underpinnings of lack of transparency, accountability, and their own inability to politically participate. In a matter of weeks, people across the MENA region were unified in a series of uprisings against their authoritarian governments, against regime brutality and extortion and repression of the security apparatus, against socio-economic deprivation and political and social marginalization. Citizens across the Middle East and North Africa marched demanding political voice. In Egypt and Tunisia, the unsocial social contract appeared to have ended. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amira, for that impassioned as well as very informed analysis of what went on. You've obviously seen it from very up close, so that makes your research even more valuable. Thank you once again for sharing that. And I would now like to invite Mehnaz from BIGD BRAC. But this is just to say to our audience that if you already have any questions, and we've had that fantastic keynote from Mushtaq, we've had that very involved reaction from Amira. So if you have any questions already, please raise your hands and we will get you on screen. Or if you want, you can even chat. But do raise your hand if you have a question. We'll take them very soon. Thanks, Mehnaz.
Thank you, Pallavi. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. So as I said, I would like to refer to the case of COVID-19 response in Bangladesh, because this is the most pertinent challenge for Bangladesh today. And we have been working with SOAS ACE for developing a response strategy that can work in this context. So for Bangladesh, this is a very new experience. Endemics in the recent past, such as Ebola and SARS, did not hit Bangladesh as much as COVID-19 has. So in recent history, we have no experience of dealing with a pandemic like this. Bangladesh has not done too well in the first 3 months of the onset, as a lot of you might know. We now have an exponentially rising number of cases and deaths. And to address this crisis, it is obvious that it is a collective action problem, not only a matter of testing, treating, containing the medical side of it, which requires institutional capacity, but also a matter of behavior change and all-out social response. And the desired outcome is not only to save lives in this case, but also save livelihoods, save education, save the social fabric of communities, and prevent as much loss as possible. So how do we mobilize a response at the scale that is required to contain this pandemic? So now if you refer to the possibilistic position that Professor Khan was talking about, we know that there is no prior understanding of costs and benefits in this situation for any party, for the state or citizens, private sector. No one really knows what they should do to ensure the best outcome for themselves. But the unique thing about this crisis is that there's really no time to pre-plan and design institutional arrangements to align incentives as we have done in other cases before. The crisis is very fast moving and it's hard to predict what is coming. So we are well aware of organizational capabilities in Bangladesh. We cannot afford to let ad hoc experimentation at different levels to operate and wait and see how they pan out. The direct cost of failure is loss of lives, which is too expensive. So what we propose as a potential model in this scenario is where multiple horizontal networks of organizations are required for delivery with built-in redundancies. So Bangladesh has many examples of horizontal networks effectively working to fight other public health challenges before. Our oral rehydration program, dealing with TB and our family planning. So there are several examples. And Bangladesh is known to have a strong, high capacity NGO sector that works in partnership with the government and often parallel to the government within horizontal channels. So will we be able to fight against COVID-19 in the same way? Well, no, there are differences in this context, right? So the nature of the crisis is such that it needs concerted efforts. The response has to be integrated, coordinated, and synchronized. Individual experimentations will be too costly. The specific nature of the crisis is such that supply chain is restricted. It's not possible for individual networks to function without the support and cooperation of other institutions and networks. So there needs to be a strong interlinkage and interdependence in the various levels of delivery to the grassroots. And in Bangladesh, compared to public health crisis that we have experienced before. Now we have a significantly weaker governance, in the sense that we have a disempowered and sort of fragmented local governance and lack of political contestations, which of course gives rise to inefficiencies. There's a low level of trust. When individual institutions know that incentives are not aligned, they have no incentive to act themselves. So NGOs can mobilize funds and resources for health interventions as much as they can, but they cannot really be effective and in this case, there's big money involved. As we all know, this response requires building new health centers, procuring health equipment, using new technology for contactless ways of working. These are all heavy investment that we're talking about, and there are several layers and different opportunities for rent seeking, which means that incentives are distorted and incentives are different at different levels. So the concept of strategic realism resonates well in this particular situation that we are in. We need a deliberate, adaptive approach to create incentives for horizontal networks of delivery to emerge. We need multiple horizontal networks to deliver each service and be able to quickly assess costs and benefits so that we can decide which networks work and which do not. What we have is a sense of organizational capabilities. So it's not that we're starting completely with a clean slate and we don't know which experiments have a higher possibility of working than others. Incentives of different actors, we have a sense of that, be it state actors, non-state actors, private sector, or citizens. So this allows us to do a first screening of a list of networks that might work. And then once in operation, we can assess how efficiently and effectively each network is able to deliver, then scale up the ones that work and scale down the ones that don't. So taking this adaptive approach may move us a little closer to success in dealing with this highly uncertain and unfamiliar crisis that we're in. I can talk more in detail later on in the second session, but that was in a nutshell what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Mehnaz. You bet I will have a lot of questions for you in the second session when we have the Q&A round for the panelists. But yes, very unfortunate situation on the ground for all developing countries and certainly for Bangladesh regarding COVID. But how you use the framework of collective action and how strategic realism might help was indeed very helpful. So thank you once again for your input there. And if I can now invite Michael from Foster, who is with us. Mehnaz joined us from Dhaka. Amira joined us from Berlin, and Michael is going to join us from Abuja. Michael, please.
Thank you very much, Pallavi. And I have to very quickly use this opportunity to thank the SOAS ACE program, first of all, for putting this discussion together, and also for the wonderful contribution that you are making in the area of improving understanding of collective action and how it works. I'm looking at the presentation made by Mushtaq, and I've just been thinking very deeply. The example I want to use would be the global problem that we have around managing natural resources, particularly in developing countries. And I want to talk especially about a collective action sort of program or initiative that was launched in 2003, which is the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. So this initiative was launched based on the possibilistic assumption that transparency leads to accountability, okay? So there's a lot of stories about abundant resources not transforming to greater wealth for countries and for their peoples. And the discussion was around why don't we make people understand more or have more information around how the resources are being managed. So that would, help people to ask questions around how resources are managed and probably lead to accountability. But over a decade and a half of implementing this collective action, the question still remains. There isn't that much. We can point to a number of successes here and there, But in countries such as ours, that's countries like Nigeria, the big question remains, there is so much information out there now because the Nigerian EITI publishes information every year about how resources are being generated and how they are being managed. But there is still no tangible, sufficient tangible evidence leading to that, to confirm that assumption about transparency leading to accountability. So what that illustrates is what Mushtaq said in his presentation, but around strategic realism and how implementation over time can lead to learning and changes in what you're now proposing as radical incrementalism. I think the EITI, especially how it is implemented in Nigeria, is some kind of an interesting example for what you're proposing. Now, in terms of what happens or what affects the success of collective action, and you've actually rightly pointed out about the constraints that can arise around economic resources and capabilities. I will talk about 4 constraints within that perspective, which we have observed in the implementation of the EITI in Nigeria. The first is the local context, the political context within which you want to organize collective action. Because you have a collective action that says that the key players will have to come together, government, business, and civil society coming together to jointly decide how to implement the collective action and to also jointly implement. So within the context, you're talking about, and again, the problem you're looking at is that of transparency. So how developed is the local context? How developed is the civil society? How developed, how conscious is the citizenry in terms of acting on information when disclosed? Okay. Now you find that in a context like ours, where there is a very weak fiscal social contract, in terms of that connection between the people and the political leaders, when the weakness is huge, so that creates a problem, because the life I live is, so long as I have nothing, so long as what government is doing does not directly affect me, so I wouldn't react, okay, to information. So people hear about a lot of money being stolen here and there, but they feel like that does not actually affect me directly. Because of that weak fiscal social contract, that lack of connection, that very weak nexus between the government and the citizens. So and then the next problem, which I will talk about because it has to do with dealing with the economic resources problem, is the kind of structure that emerges for managing collective action. Okay, so in the case of Nigeria, the EITI is supposed to be the local version of the global EITI, but it has been sort of implemented to suit the domestic environment. Okay, so you have now the EITI in Nigeria being established as an agency of government. Okay, don't forget that government originally is supposed to be the part of the group of players actually disclosing information. So you now have EITI embedded as part of government. Actually, in Nigeria, it is established by law on that.
Idea to explain what the EITI is? Just a quick explanation, full form of the EITI for members of the audience.
Okay, the EITI is the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. Okay, now it has about over 50 countries already signed up. It started off in 2003, just to say, how can we solve the problem of resource curse, particularly in developing countries? And it was discovered at that time that the best way to deal with this problem would be some sort of collective action, because any one player acting alone would be insufficient or even be detrimental to that player. And a good example was what happened in Angola. I think it was around the year 2000, where civil society put a lot of pressure on BP, the British Petroleum Company, to disclose information of the money they pay to government. Okay, so acting under that pressure, the British Petroleum actually went ahead to disclose information, but the Angolan government sort of threatened to sanction British Petroleum. So it became obvious that solving a problem of lack of transparency in the extractive sector would require all the players working together. Government disclosing what they receive from companies, and companies also publishing what they pay to government. And then the civil society now monitoring and using that information to hold the players to account. Okay, so this has been the process since 2003, and it has evolved. Okay, like I said earlier, from that possibilism of that transparency leads to accountability. Okay, so now to maintain the relevance of such a very important movement, it became necessary to ensure that this some kind of evolution has been happening, some kind of learning has been happening over time. So that's why I was trying to highlight the constraints that I would say have limited the success of EITI, both as a global movement and particularly in Nigeria. I talked about the local context first. The local context has to mature to the point where you can expect people to act effectively on information disclosed. So the EITI basically is around disclosure of information on how natural resources are being managed. Okay, so and that based on the assumption that disclosure of information would prompt people to ask questions and hold players to account. So I was talking about the governance structure. So when you have a governance structure that tries to deal with that problem of economic resources, because the idea of having EITI situated in government is to ensure that there is some kind of funding for the process, and also some kind of authority and stability given to it. But trying to do that also can undermine the success of that collective action, because it becomes how effectively can a government agency checkmate government itself? So that's a key question that arises. Now, the other kind of constraint is the nature of stakeholders that you're bringing together to be involved in a collective action movement. What is the nature of the stakeholders? How and particularly the nature of the relationships between and amongst them. Okay, so in Nigeria you have government and business, or government and industry, and a very high percentage of the oil business in Nigeria is managed through joint ventures between government and industry and companies. Okay, so I don't know how effective that would be, because there seems to be a marriage of convenience already existing prior to the collective action. So it becomes a problem because this relationship will reflect in the nature of in the way that both parties view and involve or implement the collective action process, or the EITI process in Nigeria. So what we have found is that convenience, that marriage of convenience between government and industry has also reflected in a number of ways in the effectiveness of the EITI in Nigeria. And the other not sort of constraint, but a key factor to consider is the nature of global influence, or the nature of external influence on the collective action. So if the collective action, the nature of the collective, or well, the nature of the problem to be solved, if it is globalized, sometimes it adds to the effectiveness of the collective action locally. Okay, because practically what you're trying to deal with will now be influenced by how the collective action is arranged globally. So the global EITI has already set out a structure. Nigeria is meant to just adopt. So in the process of adopting it, there are some kind of influence it has, but I would say that one has a bit more positive influence, because all Nigeria needs to do is replicate the program locally and also adhere to the standards already set. So yes, I would say I'm very, very, very much happy with what you're proposing, which is radical incrementalism. And for quite some time now, you would see that there has been that struggle to situate what is happening within the EITI into some sort of theoretical framework. And I think this is a good guide to help us explain exactly how this collective action movement is evolving over time. So thank you so much, Mushtaq, and thank you, Pallavi.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think you spoke to exactly the few points that Mushtaq brought up, and also sort of melded it very effectively with the reality that we see on Nigeria. So thank you very much for that. I can see one hand up from our audience, and this is Farwa Sial from the University of Manchester. Farwa, if you're happy, we will bring you up on stage and shine the spotlight on you. So please feel free to come up and ask your question. William, we can see you. We will bring you up right now, if that's okay with you, and then we can get back Farwa. Agatha? Thanks, William.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, great. Okay, so here's what I would like to ask the panel on how to essentially merge two somewhat related but different perspectives on collective action. Okay, so one of the ways I look at collective action problems, based in what I guess we from Mushtaq would be kind of an expanded view of Mancur-Olson. When you take some of Mancur-Olson's ideas and then you add in some things like you add in social preferences and you add in distributions of power and so on and so forth. But in this, I distinguish two basic types of collective action problems. So my question would be, how do members of the panel think that this discussion relates to the distinction I'm going to draw in a second? So the first type of collective action problem I would call a first order collective action problem. And that's essentially your classic free riding problem. How do you get people to contribute to public goods? Or you can think of it in terms of how do you get people to contribute to reducing excess conflict? How do you get people to contribute to eliminating or reducing negative externalities and so on and so forth? Suppose that you have a group of people and they have some notion of how to do this. And in the framework I'm talking about, I would call this an agreement, which is maybe informal or formal, doesn't matter, on how to distribute the various costs and benefits of heading forward with collective action. So that's what I would call a first order collective action problem. The second order collective action problem is how do you get the parties to actually honor the agreement? And so the second order collective action problem amounts to figuring out how to orchestrate or arrange the necessary coordination and enforcement so that the parties who had attempted or wanted to resolve the first order collective action problem so that they can actually do so. Or to put it slightly differently, how can you make an agreement to resolve a first order collective action problem credible? So my question then is, how would these two types of collective action problems relate to the discussion of the panel?
Mushtaq, would you like to take that first, and then we can ask the panelists around the table if they'd like to react?
Thanks, William. I think that the two questions you raised are exactly derived from a classical economics cost-benefit approach. And I think that any resolution to collective action problems must keep that in mind, right? So your first order question is actually what is the object of the collective action, right? So it's asking, can we come up with a distribution of benefits which sustains the solution? And the second one is saying, how do we then enforce that with some internal punishment and incentive strategies in repeated games, if I understand it right? So the second part is the kind of self-enforcement in a repeated game context. I think the way this connects with what I'm saying is that both of these layers of answers are subject to fundamental uncertainties about the costs and benefits themselves, right? So But the point is that not all these costs and benefits are equally uncertain and equally up for grabs. And I think the problem is that we know that in reality, as you try to implement these things, you will find that you've missed out some very important costs, and you've missed out some incentives of players who you ignored, but they're actually part of the solution, who then come in. Is that Hirschman was referring to? So he's saying that you've done a calculation based on some priors about what the costs and benefits are, but it's impossible that you have predicted all the problems and so on. And I think that Hirschman is essentially right. I mean, but if Hirschman is right, and you take it at the extreme version of that statement, then it's not worth doing any cost benefit at all, right? So then all you would say is that there is a problem. We have a hunch that it should be solvable. Let's jump in and try to solve it, and problems and opportunities will emerge. We learn from it and we get along, and in many cases we will find a solution. I don't think that's the right interpretation of Hirschman, nor is it what I describe as strategic realism. So here is what I would say. So I think that we know some of the big constraints, we know some of the difficult to shift constraints, but we also know that there are lots of other constraints which are fuzzy. We don't exactly know what they are, and we don't exactly know what all the opportunities are. But in answering both your question A and B, both your first order and second order questions, all I'm saying is that we need to be mindful of the material realities which constrain the kinds of answers that we are looking for, right? If we have done that, it's okay that we haven't answered all the details, because there are lots of things that will remain fuzzy, will remain unsure. And even if we've got a good idea of a solvable, imaginable solution, in practice it might not come about, precisely because the second order kind of problem that you allude to could not be resolved, right? So in practice, it turns out it's not a sustainable solution. So what I'm saying is that we need different types of analytical frames to inform leadership of what is feasible, right? So the first level is to actually have an idea of capabilities and economic resources, which suggest to us what the solution might be at a very specific sectoral level. And I think if I can give you an example, that might help, right? So a paper that we've just done on the power sector in Bangladesh asks the question, why is there so much collusive pricing in the power sector? And this information is publicly available and nothing happens. And the exchequer is being denuded of $1 billion a year in what is clearly a form of corruption, right? But this is transparent and open corruption. Now, what do you do about it? So you can say there are a number of collective action solutions you can think of, but not all of them would pass the test of strategic realism. So, for example, if you come up with a solution that, we have this information, let's now organize public action to prosecute these people and punish them for their collusive pricing, that's not going to work for the reasons that I've already suggested, that almost everybody in the power sector from top to bottom is engaged in some form of corruption and rule violation, and no one is going to give evidence on anyone else, and the government isn't interested, because actually a lot of this collusion is solving a specific problem, which is that no one wants to invest in this power sector without a lot of risk mitigation co-investments from government. So the question then becomes, can you do this risk mitigation in a way that is socially desirable and it results in a good outcome as opposed to a bad outcome? In other words, by first thinking a lot about the hard constraints, the material realities and the incentives and capabilities of the players, you are limiting the kinds of collective action that you think are imaginable, right? And so you rule out a kind of accountability response or a prosecution response, or the kind of response that some people say should be done, which is to remove all subsidies from the power sector, because it's the subsidies that are causing the corruption. And once we do our analysis of the material reality, it turns out plausibly, if you withdrew all the subsidies, no one would invest in the power sector because the risks are too high in a developing country context. So the risk mitigation has to happen. So then you come up with a solution which is imaginable. And the imaginable solution is that you directly subsidize, you directly provide some risk mitigation subsidies to investors, and that increases the competition and brings down the price. And when you look at the evidence, it turns out actually this happened in Bangladesh. And when it happened, it had a fantastically big effect on price because of the implicit competition that brought in. And our estimates show a 60% reduction in price by the same players in the power sector, comparing projects in which they had ex ante risk mitigation subsidies compared to where they didn't. Now, that tells us what is the imaginable collective action. The imaginable collective action is something that is likely to work given the capabilities and economic interests. And then your A and B, your first order and second order come in. You can think of what kinds of collective action would work here. We then give this as a proposal to the policymakers, the World Bank, the government, and then possibilism takes over. There will be a lot of detail about how exactly you form the coalitions, how do you enforce it, how do you punish the people who are breaking the deal, and so on. But it's operating within a context where the overall solution is imaginable in terms of what the actual evidence shows is already happening in that country. I think that's the way you connect it. So those two things that you spoke of, that you referred to, are absolutely the kind of Olsonian tradition, but it has to be embedded in the realist tradition of what is feasible. Otherwise, you might spend a lot of time proposing an accountability-based or a subsidy withdrawal-based solution, which, in our opinion, the evidence says won't work. I think that what you are saying and what we are saying is completely compatible if you think of it as a combination of different levels of analysis. Hope that answered your first question.
Thanks, William. Thanks, Mushtaq, for your answer. I think we're running short of time. I know we have time till 10:45, and there's another session to go. So then, since this was more a theoretical question aimed at Mushtaq, I think Farwa, my click on you, finally been able to sort the issue out. We can get Farwa on stage. And Farwa, go right ahead and ask your question. Then we'll roll quickly into the panel discussion, have a short round, and then open it up to more questions. Go for it, Farwa.
Can you hear me now? Okay, yeah, I had a question for all the panelists, but now because we don't have time, I'm going to quickly just ask two questions. First is for Mushtaq. So it's a very philosophically heavy discussion for this early in the morning, because it's talking about structure and agency. And I have a particular interest in this because we see a recent move towards the so-called small doable solution towards poverty reduction, which are the RCTs, or randomized controlled trials. But what you're suggesting is incrementalism, but from a structural perspective, and it's basically addressing the design framework. At the same time, it's not mechanistic, which means that it acknowledges the temporality of coalitions. And my question is, what are your thoughts about state planning in this context? You know very well that we used to live in a universe where we had these 5-year plans, and suddenly they were no longer valid in a lot of developing countries. So how do you see the role of state within this? And my other question is for Amira, and thank you for the very important discussion on the Arab Spring. I really like your concept of unsocial and social contract. And I just wanted to ask your thoughts about the role of Muslim Brotherhood at the time when they emerged as the providers of social welfare for a lot of people. So in a way, it was a vacuum of the state, but it led them to play a very active role. So I just wondered if you could speak to that.
Mushtaq, do you want to give a quick, I know there's no quick response to what Farwa said, but as summarized a response, and we can come back.
I think very quick response is that I think those kinds of, thick documents of 5-year plans is exactly what Hirschman was against, and I would be too. I think what states need are broad vision statements of the kinds of problems they want to resolve. It could be just a couple of pages. And then the detailed implementation of it at the sectoral level needs very detailed analysis of the type that I was referring to about the power sector in Bangladesh. That is not the kind of analysis that happens in the typical 5-year plan, which is simply looking at intersectoral connections and trying to predict what needs to happen in different sectors. That is often actually quite useless, and I'm completely with Hirschman on that, right? So I think the state's role is huge. The state's role is to facilitate and finance and enforce, and it's an important player. But I think exactly this kind of strategic realism is what the states should adopt. But the states need help from us as academics and thinkers and activists to say that, here are things that we think is doable. And I think the problem with states in developing countries in particular is that they don't have a portfolio of doable things, right? And then they fall into all kinds of traps of trying to find doable things on hunches and common sense, which often turn out to be not doable. I'll stop there.
Yeah. Okay. No. So thank you very much, Mushtaq, and thanks, Farwa, for your questions. Amira says that she would like to answer your question in the second half of the intervention. So if you hang around till then, we'll get around to it for sure. So now what I'm going to do is get the panelists back on the table, the virtual table, so to say, and have a quick round of discussion based on the interventions that they made initially. So maybe, Agatha, if you can get Amira on stage. I had abused my position as chair to jot down a few questions based on their reactions. So if Amira could be on stage and we could have a quick chat with her on this. Perfect. I'm just going to ask you a very short question, because what's always from what seemed like a very common uprising, a lot of very common pent-up anger, we've also seen very widely diverging outcomes across the states that took part in the Arab Spring, quote unquote. So, why in relative terms would you think, do you think indeed in relative terms that Tunisia is a relative success to the outcome that we see in Egypt? Ben Ali's regime ended, subsequently RCD's regime also ended, but in Egypt you still have that same subset of elite, in different form, but same subset staying on and hanging on to power. What do you think it was? Was it the balance of power in the kind of mobilizations that we saw in the two states? What is your opinion about it?
Okay, so thanks again. And Farwa, I will implicitly in the answer to Pallavi's question also answer yours. So as Pallavi said, Tunisia is finding its way to a more inclusive development model and has signed the Social Pact. The Social Pact was signed by government, by Employers Association, by Workers Association, by the Order of Lawyers, to unlock new ways and establish industrial relations in Tunisia. So Tunisia is a relative success story where they have a social dialogue and they are heading towards a better social contract, if we can say. Although, of course, the economic direction is not as clear, and also the political direction, but for now we can say it's a lot more better than it is for Egypt. In Egypt, the unsocial social contract has entrenched further, and the army is taking the role of a leading business group, again using industrial policy to political ends. And it has a very strong engagement in the economy, which makes it an interested party rather than an impartial arbiter. So to answer Pallavi's question, why do we see this differing or this divergent evolution of the social contract? So I would argue that civil society capabilities, in line with Mushtaq's terminology, but also the configuration of power of conflicting factions in the relative political settlements are the main source of this difference. So in Egypt, once the Muslim Brotherhood reached power, the mistake they did is that they only catered for their constituency and their political base, neglecting four very powerful groups of society. So they neglected the elites, who, as in Mushtaq's work on political settlements, in a clientelist settlements, need to be kept satisfied with various types of rents. They neglected the security apparatus and other parts of the deep state, the judiciary, the police. So all these institutions that enjoyed favorable positions under the old social contract. They ignored the modern liberal minds who feared a strong religious comeback. And they also, of course, ignored the army, who is a major political player in Egypt. And the army tried over and over to be part of that ruling coalition, but was snubbed by the Muslim Brotherhood. And so you see these distributive conflicts, like Mushtaq mentioned, and here in terms of distribution of power. And this is where the real resistance and the stumbling blocks were. So these four groups made up those groups that preferred a different outcome to the collective action problem altogether. They wanted a completely different outcome. So since the solution has to be one in which the capabilities, that matches the capabilities of the people undergoing the change, obviously the capabilities of the army together with the security apparatus and the other deep state players outgrew any other forces in society. And so in a divided country like Egypt, one in which the ruling coalition was not yet sufficiently concentrated, the army used this situation in its favor. It mobilized the other outcome wishers together and to lead and support its military coup in July 2013, calling it another revolution against religious fascism. So the Muslim Brotherhood made a big mistake here, that they catered only for their constituency. I wouldn't say this was, like Mushtaq says, there was a problem of economic resources or limited economic resources. I would rather think that the Muslim Brotherhood genuinely didn't want to cooperate with these people because these people didn't want to cooperate with them. The Muslim Brotherhood had to literally have parallel institutions, create parallel institutions so that they can operate. They had a parallel police station. They had a parallel group in the Ministry of Finance to run things because no one is cooperating with them among the big heads of these institutions. So that's for Egypt. For Tunisia, the country does not have the same inherent forced stability provided by the army as in Egypt, which was, Egypt has been a military state since independence, and the military is a clear political player, unlike the case in Tunisia. So the lack of these institutional breaks has allowed Tunisia to launch on a more ambitious path of social dialogue. Ben Ali's fast exit to Saudi Arabia allowed for a reframing of state-society relations very quickly. But very important also is the capabilities of Tunisia's civil society, which played a very large role. So the new Tunisian civil society is characterized by a fast-moving way through which it swiftly created new institutionalized framework for public participation. So that's the first change they did very fast after the first weeks of the revolution, I would say. So although they have been repressed into acting within the strict parameters of corporatist social civil society before the revolution, they managed to actually, Tunisia's civic activists managed to mobilize collectively, triggering this wave of Arab Spring everywhere across the Arab world. So the civil society in Tunisia was a lot larger than that in Egypt, had more experience and expanded a lot more than in Egypt. And so in the midst of the revolutionary transition, Tunisia's institutional reform began by addressing the right of association and assembly for civil society groups as well as for citizens. Civil society in Tunisia quickly gained autonomy and ability to effect changes. And the new laws gave civil society rights to comment on and influence pending government policy and legislation and empowered it a great deal. I will stop here because of the time constraints, I know.
No, I know this is such a fascinating topic, but thank you so much, Amira, once again. I'll quickly, what you said was, it's unfortunately interesting because we're in the middle of a pandemic and, you're talking about how to work with alternative governance structures. So it's not easy to summarize quickly, but what would such an adaptive and integrated framework actually look like? What is the kind of different networks of horizontal intervention? If you could just summarize that for us, because I'm sure it's something that would interest the audience. Mehnaz?
So very quickly, so there are 4 components to the response that we are envisioning. The first one is minimizing the number of new cases. That's a community level intervention. The second one is providing home-based care. So we make sure that the load on the health facilities is low, because Bangladesh does not have the capacity of taking on the kind of health system load that's coming on. The third is providing primary COVID care. community level health clinics. And then the fourth is zonal lockdowns, so managing hotspots. So very quickly, if I give you an example, what we are struggling with right now is that we have announced several hotspots, red zones as they call it, but we have not operationalized or figured out how to manage these hotspots. So currently it is assumed that the government is in charge of delivering essential goods and services in the red zones. Compared to other countries in the region, we are way behind in this case, figuring out the functional mechanism of how to do this. So we have announced the red zones, but we have not been able to enforce lockdowns, but because the government has no functional operational way of providing these essential goods. Now, there are many possible horizontal networks that could work here other than the government. Actors could include the private sector, the local retailers, large corporations that manage supply chain management, NGOs, local volunteers. There are several possibilities that we could try out very quickly right now. We have a long list of red zones where we could try out different horizontal networks for this specific delivery of essential goods and see which one works best instead of spending so much time for the government to figure out how to do it within its own mechanisms.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Manaz. I mean, that really was a very effective summary. So I think we'll have a clearer idea of what you exactly meant. Thanks again. Michael, if we could have Michael quickly on stage. That's Michael from Foster. Yeah, so rather sort of big question that you have a short time to answer, but you said something very interesting about, full transparency does not lead to accountability. And, you and I have both seen that from our work in Nigeria. You pretty much have full information about who's doing what, where the money is going, how the rents are being captured, but that does not translate to accountability. So I'm just thinking, while there is the information gap, the solution is not always about bridging the information gap or addressing the information asymmetry, but what is working at the heart of it is a power asymmetry. There's a political problem that even after you solve the information problem, the political problem isn't solved. So is there something would you agree with something like that? And that's a huge problem with the success of collective action movements. And in your experience, is that something that you've come across?
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually why I mentioned that, that learning process brings quite a lot on board in terms of managing or organizing collective action. Because one of the problems which I identified is in the case of Nigeria, the context within which you're working. Now, it was discovered a long time ago. Nigeria started a process of changing the laws governing the oil industry, and the real essence was, first of all, the existing laws are quite obsolete. Okay, so you need to bring them up to date to be able to take into account changes in the global industry, the need to actually even embed the process or recognize the process of the collective action for for changing or reforming the sector. Okay, so for the past decade, over a decade, Nigeria has been trying to enact a new law called the Petroleum Industry Bill. Okay, to replace all existing laws governing the sector. Okay, last dispensation or last year, Nigeria came quite close to getting the law into place. The National Assembly, which is the legislature, actually passed a particular component of the law, the Petroleum Industry Governance Bill, which would sort of embed new laws that will improve investment, improve governance, improve performance and management of the sector, right? So for political reasons, mostly for political reasons, and for quite a long time, the law was not passed. But last year, the law was eventually passed by the legislature, but the president refused to sign the law. Okay, so now clearly tells you that sort of political imbalance. The entire country, everyone wanted the law passed, but the president didn't want the law passed for just one reason, right? Okay, well, a number of reasons were given, but the prominent reason was that he was not happy with the leader of the National Assembly or the leader of the legislature at that time, and that came just to it. Okay, I mean, efforts of several years, coming down to just the president declining to sign a law because he was not happy or he was not agreeing, he was in conflict with the leader of the National Assembly at that time. So this illustrates clearly I think one thing that Williams also mentioned in his question about the first order collective action problem, which is agreeing what the issue is. So we got to a point where the whole collective action around lack of transparency, there was agreement around the fact that transparency would lead to accountability. Okay, so now what I want to add to Williams and also to Mushtaq's explanation is that there needs to also be like a third order question. How do we manage flexibility around these issues? So because when you notice that there should be changes in the agreement, as you know, William used the terminology agreement, which is the first agreement is what is the problem we want to solve. Okay, you need to build in some sort of framework that will help you at some time recognize that there is need for us to redefine the problem. So as at the time that we had lack of transparency as the problem, we are getting to a point where there is so much information out there and things are not changing. In fact, I can tell you there is something also creeping in, especially within the Nigerian environment, which is information fatigue, data fatigue. There seems to be quite a lot of data out there. And people are asking, what do we use this information for? So you have to get to the point where you redefine the problem, okay? So it's a collective process as well. So everybody will have to still come together and say, I know some time ago we agreed this was the problem. Now, are we at a point, we have sufficient evidence at this point to say, how do we redefine the problem? And also, that second layer of how do we honor the problem? The EITI, for quite a long time, has gone through several iterations of its standards and reporting.
Michael, since this is virtual, unfortunately, we can't stay on in the room for much longer. We're already at 10:45. I am really, really sorry. I know this wasn't a question that I lobbed at you. Mushtaq, would you like to round all of this off? Because we've had some really fascinating insights from the community level, the macro-national level, the sectoral level, how it adds up to policy, and how we use it in our ACE work. So very quickly, Mushtaq, we don't have much time, just perhaps a couple of minutes, difficult though that is, but yeah. Thank you, all three of you, Amira, Mehnaz, and Michael.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so fantastic discussion.
Yeah.
And we will have to continue this conversation amongst ourselves over time. I think a lot of issues came up which are actually completely consistent and reinforcing each other's thinking. So Amira's point that, the differences between Tunisia and Egypt, actually successful democracies in developing countries all have to have some element of compromise and off-budget, informal. And the problem with Egypt was that the Brotherhood was not willing to do those compromises. And the secular leaders of the Arab Spring were also not willing to make compromises. Whereas in Tunisia, as in other developing country democracies, those off-budget transfers are what keeps progress happening. And that incremental progress is what will eventually take us one day, with any luck, to the rule-following kinds of societies that we want. But we can't get that on day one. I think this is a really important point, that it's an incremental progress. And I think the other points made by Michael and Mehnaz are entirely, so Mehnaz's point about the importance of experimentation is in some cases is precisely that incremental strategy is not clear because there is too much unknown and too much uncertainty. And one response to having an incremental strategy which is realistic is actually to celebrate or organize multiple deliveries so that we can scale up. So that's a very specific response to a humongous crisis, which is the COVID-19 crisis in countries like Bangladesh, which is exceptional. So we have adapted our strategic realism to a completely different form to respond to a crisis where the uncertainty is unprecedented. And I think that Michael's point about the Nigerian oil is exactly, it's not just that you have to have collective action, but what is the collective action about isn't clear. And I think one thing that we need to work on in Nigeria is what is a feasible, imaginable set of things that should happen with the oil revenues? And can we get the parties who are the important players to agree on that. And we can only do that if we understand what their interests are and what their capabilities are. And once you connect that, we answer Michael's question of the third step, which is how do you adapt? But you can only adapt around a broad objective which makes sense, which is imaginable. And I think that's still work to be done in the Nigerian case. So I'll end there because I know we have run out of time. Thanks, Pallavi, for organizing it so well.
It was huge teamwork, and thanks very much to Michael Cornier, who was our technical volunteer. He really helped us out to the last part. We did have another question from PB Anand from the University of Bath, but maybe if he slipped off to another panel, but I can't see that now. So given that we are wrapping up, it's time to call this panel to a close. Thank you so much, Amira, Mehnaz, Michael, Mushtaq, of course, for such a riveting discussion. We heard many complexities and contexts laid out all together. If you want to continue with the conversation, we can drop emails to us. You can visit us on our website, and we'll be in touch. You can be in touch with us. But for now, thanks again for joining. We've had almost 2 hours in the morning of some very, very heavy stuff, but I think it's been very relevant and worth it. Thank you. Thank you once again.
Thank you.